So let's start by getting Web API in a new project. I'm here in Visual Studio 2012, and I'm going to create a new project. In this case, I'm going to just create an ASP.NET MVC4 web application. There isn't a project specifically for Web API. It's a sub-project of ASP.NET MVC4. And I'm just going to call it New Web API. And when we get here to the wizard in Visual Studio 2012, it'll be similar in 2010. In 2013, they've changed this up a bit, but you'll be able to get the sense of what you want, is we can create different kinds of web applications, internet applications, web API applications, which is just a raw web API project. Though some of these other projects are going to include web API, or at least include the ability to add web API to them. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and just create it as a straight web API project. Let's explore this a little bit so we can see some of the base concepts of web API in case you're not familiar with them already. In the global ASAX file, there's going to be a application start section, and this is whenever your application is started up. This isn't once per request, but once per startup of the application. Depending on how you have IIS configured or even Azure configured, this may be more often than you might imagine, but it is not once on every request. And at this point, there's a number of configuration that happens. There's configuration for areas, for filters, for routes, for MVC routes, for bundling. What we're interested in is this web API config registration. So I'm going to navigate over to this by hitting F12 if you're not familiar with the shortcut. And this is going to take us to a class that actually exists inside the app start directory, web API config. And this contains one and only one static method called register that's going to do the startup configuration. The first thing it does is configure a default route for web API. This route is a pattern match. When someone hits the server with a URI, it's going to attempt to match these against these routes. ASP.NET MVC can have their own routes. These are in addition to those routes. It's pretty commonplace for these routes to start with API/ and then have whatever the controller name is, and optionally what the ID inside that controller is. Now what this base project has done is created a controller for us called values controller. If you're familiar with ASP.NET MVC, this may look a little familiar, but this is an API controller instead of a plain old controller. This is a web API specific controller that knows that we want to do this convention-based mapping. So the name of the controller is called values. And so what the web API configuration is going to do, let's go back there, is if we come into API/values, it's going to look for the controller called values controller. It's going to take whatever the name of the controller we specify here and match it to a controller in the project that has a name plus the name controller. Again, this is by convention. We don't have to set up configuration for this. Let's go ahead and run this in the browser briefly. And you'll see during this course I'm going to use Firefox as the browser because I can use Firebug to do some interesting things. We'll also use a tool called Fiddler in order to more easily do things like post, put, patch, delete to the server. But for simple gets, this is a good place to start. So if I go up to the address bar and just type API/values, this is going to call into the controller for values and issue a GET. In the HTTP stack, GET is one of the verbs you can issue, and browsers typically issue GETs in order to get information. It's the most common verb. When you go to a website, it issues a GET to that website for that page you're looking for, and then the server returns the information that is the value of the page. The same thing with Web API here. In fact, if we go ahead and look at the values controller, there is a GET method that returns a list of strings or an enumerable collection of strings. And we can see here that it's mapping it to this exact method because we're issuing a GET. We're issuing a GET with no additional parameters. Again, it's just value, so it knows it's an empty call to GET. So if we change this to add a new value, and reissue it, it will return the value. And this return value by default is JSON. So this is the syntax in JSON for a simple array of values. In that same way, if we look at our code, we can see that there's an additional get that takes an ID. This ID was specified in the configuration file as part of that route pattern. So if the ID is specified after the controller, it is specified as a new parameter called ID, and it's optional. That's why we could call it without it. And what it does here is just return a string called value. It returns a single instance of some object. So we go back to the browser and we change this to /1, we can see that value being returned. One of the things that's not super obvious here is that whatever is being returned here is being converted into a JSON object for us, or XML in those cases, but we'll talk about that in a minute. If we change this to just return object, we can then construct an object on the fly, and I'll just use an anonymous type and say name equals value and ID equals, and I'm just going to pluck in the ID that we're being passed in as part of that data. Now when we execute values1, it's going to return us a JSON object that is going to include the name as whatever we specified, and then the ID. This is a core idea in Web API that you're going to deal with and return simple return types here, and that Web API itself will figure out how to format it. What's interesting is that we have this value that's being sent in as the ID. In this case, it's a 1. If we change it to a 5, it'll go ahead and pass it through as a 5. But that this is implicitly an integer. It's an integer because by convention, we've asked for an integer in the API. If we change this to foo, Web API is responsible for mapping the URI values into whatever values are available on the controller. It's trying to do smart mapping between those, so you don't have to worry about writing some sort of code that's going to figure out how to manipulate and push these values directly into your controllers. This is all interesting, but this isn't the real API we want to build. Let's next talk about how to add Web API to existing projects, because that's a much more common case.